Hello, everybody. Welcome to episode number 4 of the Mongoose podcast. Tonight, I am joined by the Distributist, who, well, we're going to be talking about a series he did and a aspect of culture he's been touching on, which is nerd or geek culture. He's recently completed a very excellent series of videos examining nerd culture, exactly what it is, what he sees as the problems with it, and what he thinks he could do to make it better. So, thanks for coming on.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I actually recorded the series about a month ago, but it went on the channel last week, so I finally finished the editing. But thanks for having me on again.
Yeah. For those astute enough to have seen it briefly, I thought that his second to last episode was the last episode, so I left an embarrassing comment thinking it was, but thankfully I fixed it. But so briefly, could you sort of touch on what exactly your series has been about? I'll actually link it in the description of the video for people to check out, which I highly encourage people to do. But sort of briefly, could you describe exactly what your series of videos touches on?
Sure. So it's a YouTube series. I do series of about 5 or 6 videos about given communities and what's wrong with them, or an extended topic that people ask me a lot about. And this one was about something that comes up a lot on YouTube, which I would broadly call nerd culture. Nerd culture broadly being the association with things like science fiction, video games, board games, sort of introverted personalities and the interests that typically surround them. And they're really in the waning years of the Bush administration and leading right on to where we are right now. This became a very primary identity for a lot of people. It had been for a while as a fringe community, but it really sort of turned a corner in the mid to late 2000s in a way that was really surprising. And so I decided to do a series sort of giving a retrospective on it. And that's the 6-part series. I don't know in particular, there was a lot of information, so I'm not so sure exactly what you want to talk about. But
well, I think that's as good as a brief overview. And I think because one of the things you really touch on, or I think a place we could start is sort of the identity of the nerd itself, where this type of person came from. Because you sort of point out in the beginning of the series, if somebody were to say to you nerd or geek, everybody sort of has a image in their head of what that sort of idealized version of a geek or nerd is. And it sort of comes from there have been predominantly men and some women like this throughout all history and throughout many different cultures, especially Western culture, though, of being these very socially awkward, socially inept, but incredibly brilliantly highly focused characters like Isaac Newton or many composers like Beethoven, who sort of notoriously artists and scientists tend to be very have very poor social skills, but be very brilliant in certain areas. But it seems that only with the sort of you touch on the creation of the teenager in the mid 20th century, how this sort of spread to not just the sort of few people like Isaac Newton or Ludwig van Beethoven, but to large numbers of people who really ended up just having a keen interest in not just the sciences, but in sort of the emerging genres of science fiction and fantasy. And it eventually sort of led itself in quite naturally as a sort of into the sort of counterculture movement as it eventually became absorbed within the progressive movement. And now it seems that they've been thrown under the bus.
Yeah, that's what I went over in my series.
Mm-hmm. So what I think we could talk about, or next what we can mention on is, so one of the, hold on, I have the notes here of this, is what are some of the things that you sort of mentioned in your series could be done to reverse course or chart a new course for these types of largely young Western males towards a culture or towards focuses which are at the very least less self-destructive? Because at this point, I agree, even as somebody that plays video games a lot myself, though is starting to wean off of them, that they can be highly addictive and really not constructive in any way, as opposed to somebody that obsesses over, let's say, reading classic literature or researching sciences. They seem like giant time sinks. I think there's merit to them, but the current culture that they surround themselves in now is, I think, in many ways destructive.
So the question was, what are ways that you can take the hobbies and make them better? Or is the question whether I think these things are destructive or how I think the current iteration of these cultural fixtures is destructive?
Well, I think what I broadly wanted to talk about is what elements or what culture, hobbies, focuses do we think that this demographic could instead focus on that would be more constructive?
I don't think it's the type of hobbies. I think it's the relationship they have to people's identities. And I think that the consumer relationship is what's destructive. Now,
Yeah.
maybe there's a non-consumeristic way. I guess if you're a programmer and you work on developing mods, you interact with video games in a non-consumeristic way.
Oh yeah.
But for the most part, that's not the case. Or if you're someone who does esports, there might be a little bit less of a consumeristic aspect. But for the most part, video games is sort of a particularly bad example. And it's sort of the new one on the scene. All the other iterations are just iterations of media that we've had before. Video games is the one that's actually just brand new. So,
yeah.
It's a little bit hard because with video games, you're not exactly so sure how much of what you're reacting to is new technology. With older forms of media, you could go, okay, well, what did people do in the past to keep this under control? And how was it sort of structured better? But with video games, it's always very difficult. We can certainly look to things like chess if we're talking about something like StarCraft. But if it's like a fully immersive experience like Skyrim or something like that, we really have very few analogies that work going forward. But at any rate, what's really destructive about these relationships is sort of, I say consumerism is sort of a buzzword, but when I always say the relationship of total passivity, that sort of emerged. And, I think that a lot of times Gamergate, as much as I think that it had some legitimate complaints, it oftentimes did fall into a lot of the stereotypes its enemies had about it, which is that it was an excuse for indolence and an apology for the status quo in a lot of ways.
And sort of looking back at it, it almost seems just a little sad that this is the thing that sort of people are going to push back on, is like you can take away almost anything else, but when you start touching with video games, that's when people draw the line. And it's like, this is one of the things that you say in your series that I think really struck a chord with me is like, and it's something I've really started noticing, is when people start it's like the sort of attitude people have of like, just let me play my video games and leave me alone. I don't want to deal with any outside influence whatsoever. And, like I've seen some reviews of The Last Jedi, and two of them are, I think, they explain like a type of personality that is able to criticize it much more objectively. And I would say when you have your sort of Distributist guide to LARPing is firmly on the sort of costume level, or the not really taking it that seriously level. Another one sort of taking it on the cringe level. Yeah, go ahead first.
I think what you're saying, you're referencing something I brought up in my last video, which I kind of jokingly dubbed the Distributist's first law of LARPing, which is that LARPing becomes more or less acceptable if it's done very, very unseriously or very, very seriously. And this is the difficulty that nerd culture has, is that it's sort of in the middle. People adopt these identities to a degree where it's impossible to say that they're not adopting it as an identity, but not to the degree that you'd ever be able to go, okay, this is a principle that I'm living by. This is something that I'm trying to live up to. And so these identities essentially get adopted to the extent of self-gratification and not anything that would ever be able to guide someone in a larger way or to creating a larger community.
And I think like, two good examples. The one on the, I think not taking it seriously side is let's say I just dress up as like Iron Man for Halloween, like, it's a joke for Halloween.
Yeah, and then on the costume for Halloween, this is essentially not serious. Right. And
then like if you do go to
days where you get together and have a party in a costume,
or if you're like if you go to like,
no one's gonna be like, okay, he thinks he's Iron Man, right?
Yeah. Or if you're just going to a convention and it's like, I'm just gonna dress up as a character for fun, but then like on the other healthy or good end of the spectrum is like would be YouTube channels like Lindy Beige or Scalgrim, where they're so obsessed with like these medieval weapons that they learn, like that they've now become sort of, totally invested in them, and they're veritable encyclopedias of knowledge on this stuff. And
it's obvious that Lindy Beige actually cares about martial attitudes and martial virtues, and he tries to follow that as much as he can in his real life. And it's just like these. I mean, I know I use the example, and I'm sort of repeating what I said in my videos, but how much do you respect someone who dresses up like a Klingon constantly but doesn't embody any idea of warrior virtue? I mean, certainly that's the most important thing you can take from a Klingon, right?
And I think that's one of the things we've talked about, but it's not specifically mentioned in your series, is that I suppose one of the healthier ways going forward would be, what if somebody was able to link Klingons to being able to look at actual martial cultures in history and then start actually studying that? Then I think we're going somewhere.
But I know, you can historically LARP too. It's not like it's not the subject; it's your relationship to the subject. I mean, if you're going to all of these martial, like, I mean, if someone dressed up like King Leonidas and didn't exert any stoicism, would that be better? Maybe a little bit, right? It would be a little bit better because it actually happened.
Yeah, right? And
but that's not the big. That's the smaller problem, not the big problem. The bigger problem is this person is essentially trying to evoke the identity of a character that, well, I mean, he kind of obviously lacks the key virtue of and is also not simultaneously pursuing that virtue, even in aspiration.
It's sort of like, because I've been to a number of like Civil War reenactments, when you see a bunch of like old fat guys dressed as Civil War soldiers, where it's like, no, not exactly how those soldiers actually would have looked, but like, and it's
there's always Falstaffian characters, and as people get older, they generally get a little bit fatter, and that's going to be like something you do on your weekends. The problem is when it becomes like an identity, right?
Yeah.
Like I don't know, like, frankly, the only Civil War reenactors I've ever known were basically history buffs who are old timers, and there wasn't this kind of cringy confusion between fantasy and reality the way there is in lots of contemporary iterations of nerd culture that you see in, like, I don't know, Seattle's Emerald City Comic-Con. I didn't even get roughly the same vibe.
And I see it like, and I agree with you there, is I think, just to sort of plug my own love for a moment, is I do think, well, you're probably right when it comes to the fact that it's the relationship somebody has to the subject, to the hobby, and not the hobby itself. I do think there is a definite difference with history because, first off is the fact that it did actually happen, and that sort of, it takes you out of the sort of escapism of a lot of science fiction and fantasy, wherein, like, okay, this martial culture, let's take the Spartans or the Teutonic Order or the Knights Templar, like, yes, they are separated from us by the centuries and by culture, but you can't get around the fact that they're real, that these were real people who did real things and built a lot of the basis for why our civilization is the way it is today. And, making people...
Yeah, but you can still fall into the danger zone category with those things, even if they were historically real. And that's the danger, right? I mean, essentially what you want to do is you want to take what you truly love about those characters and bring it as much into your life as you possibly can.
You don't want...
That's the correct way to do LARP.
Yeah, in a way, it's like you want to take the virtues that they extolled and apply them to yourself in the modern world.
Or even the things that are beautiful, right?
Yeah.
Like the things that you actually think are something that people would enjoy. I mean, I was considering doing it. I don't have time to do another video. I probably will do a video follow-up on this subject. I mean, you can't, I don't think that, it's useful for people to go around and say, like, oh, instead of eating that donut, you should run a marathon. It's more useful to say, okay, instead of eating that donut, you should eat like a pear or something like that. Like, you can't replace unlike things with like a harder virtuous thing. It doesn't work. But if we could take something that would be, if we could take something that kind of looked roughly equivalent, I know it seems like I'm kind of rambling here, right? But if we were to take like the neckbeard, the classic self-obsessed person who, I mean, and okay, so what is he? He's like he's too indulgent, he's lazy, he's kind of a little bit body humor and gross. Well, is that really what's wrong with the neckbeard? Is that why he's such a contemptible figure? Well, look, there are characters like that have been heroic. I mean, my own channel icon is one such character. Falstaff is another such character. The bards of old are another such character. Okay, but what's the big difference between Falstaff,
G.K.
Chesterton, like even Cousin Santa Claus or whatever, right? And the neckbeard. Oh well, that's obvious. Those other people care deeply about bringing joy to other people, and so you can kind of see what was sort of noble about these things in the past, and it's not always like a hard virtue. Sometimes it's just an element of what they did and what they practiced in their own lives. I mean, Beethoven, it's an easy example. I mean, you don't need to ask what the virtue of Beethoven is. You have his music, right?
Yeah.
Which is and so bring that to other people there's that's not LARP, right? It's ridiculous to even think about it as LARP. It's just practicing an art. It's a practice, and maybe I don't know if anyone's obsessed with the person of Beethoven, but I mean, I guess you want to bring forward the best of that person into reality, preferably for the edification and joy of others, and not just indulge in your own personality.
And I think in part there's potential in the sort of in the love of science fiction and fantasy to sort of bring back at least some form of beauty and goodness and truth to the modern world. Like, as you've said before as well, that like one of the core problems that plagues modern culture in terms of production is the inability to produce anything that's of actual beauty. And it almost seems like in the real world and the fantasy worlds created by nerds, there's the sort of the two extremes have sort of gone, well, they've gone wild, where in the real world you have it where it's only the ugliness that I suppose reflects reality, or just, soup cans and tampons and dirty mattresses. And then like you have these, anime, I will admit, especially has this problem of hyper romanticism where everything is sort of aesthetically perfect, but there's no connection to reality. And I'm just wondering, like right now, thinking, is there any way that these fantasy worlds, or the people that create these worlds, could bring them back, or could apply any of this understanding of beauty to the real world?
Well, I guess it's hard to say how a fantasy work brings beauty back. I mean, presumably it contains beauty in it, right? I mean, the difficulty with fantasy has always been the fact that it's isolated in an unreal world, which makes whatever romanticism it projects even less real. I mean, there's sort of a romantic fad in the early 19th century when it came to literature, which is, it wasn't exactly the most, there are not many books that come from that era that are really held up as great pieces of literature, because people felt that those books were just totally unrealistic. But now our romanticism is even further removed by the fact that it exists in these fantasy worlds, which is perhaps it's necessary, because modern man can't even imagine something like that happening in the real world. And that's something that's different between the modern man of the 21st century and the person of the 19th century. As the 19th century person could imagine something realistic that was incredibly edifying happening. And if you go to something like the Brothers Karamazov or Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, those are realist novels. I think that, I guess you could say, well, I'm sure Tolkien has inspired a generation of people to try to seek out spirituality and high things, but I think the difficulty is that none of the people who came after him were really able to do anything else but create iterations of fantasy that was totally removed from human experience.
And I mean, and you sort of see the interesting thing with Tolkien, because, Wells, he probably almost certainly had to be one of these hyper-focused individuals to be able to create this entire, uh, world of Middle Earth. The thing is, look what he did. He fought in the Somme. He got married and had numerous children, and not only that, but he connected to reality by some of his more famous works, or some of his or lesser known works, is his translations of Beowulf.
The problem is not with Tolkien. The problem is with the contemporary culture.
Yeah.
I mean, Tolkien in many ways comes from a world that no longer exists. And a lot of his popularity and the realism that you see in his fantasies comes from the fact that he came from a bucolic environment that's just really not the reality in the modern world. Mm-hmm. Now, I don't know what that means. Does that mean we need to radically reimagine the fantasy genre? I think we do. Mm-hmm. I doesn't mean that we need to walk away from medieval fantasy in a large way, perhaps. I have my favorite sci-fi and how I think it might offer some insight into how to go forward. But, it's sort of an open question, right? Like, I can't say that a given approach to any one of these art forms is going to necessarily work, but it's got to create something that's a little bit, if you want to use something like fantasy or science fiction to really strike a blow in modern culture, I think it's got to start walking away from a lot of the, and I love Tolkien, right? Mm-hmm. It's got to start. It's got to figure out what's wrong with this, and try to figure out, what Tolkien was really trying to do.
I think it's not so much going. It's not so much a rejection of Tolkien as in it's walking away from endless copies of his world with dwarf, human, elf, orc, and just sort of the really, honestly, it's quite boring at this point of the generic fantasy worlds. Like, I don't want to like explore any of these worlds anymore because they just seem so boring. But like, it's sort of why I like a lot of low fantasy. Like, I'll probably plug this in a video I'm going to do on anime in the coming weeks. But one of my favorites is Spice and Wolf, which I would classify as a low fantasy, wherein the world that it's depicted.
Low fantasy. Is it like Conan the Barbarian?
It's more like the world that's set up is actually incredibly realistic in terms of like it looks very much, it operates very much like Eastern Europe in around the Market Revolution of the 13th century, and only the main character and very few others actually have any elements of the supernatural. And it's really the fact that like this is not a world that's filled with like magical races and wizards and dragons. It's like there's this one character that's a ancient spirit, and it's her trying to find her way home, but living in a very realist, like a very.
So is it a little bit like Game of Thrones then? Like they have fantastic elements, but they kind of cut it back so it looks a little bit more like Renaissance Europe, with obviously the exception of Christianity.
There's essentially a Christianity in that environment. Like there is a church environment, and like they have cathedrals and whatnot. It's not specified as Christianity, but like
it's like the Crystal Dragon Jesus anime thing.
The thing is, the church is really more as sort of an. It's not really like an active like character in itself. It's sort of like you could imagine this taking place in, let's say, like a Poland circa 1200, but like there's in the manga version of it, there's actually a nice sort of pro-theism scene where one of the characters is a daughter of a priest, because it's not Christianity. She's like, when she meets the main character, who's this ancient wolf spirit, she's like, okay, what does this mean about God? Because I only believe in one God, but now there's this thing that people think is a God. And she sort of like goes through a crisis of faith. And then at the end of it, she's like, well, no, it just sort of shows that God is, greater than I could have imagined, that it's not, that he's not a purely material, like he's not a God that's pure reason. He's also mystical and, supernatural as well. And
is that something, do you think the artist is trying to convey?
In a way, I mean, it sort of just goes out and says it. I think
is sort of always the question. I kind of went through a phase with anime too, and I kind of got to the point where I became highly skeptical of the messages that were appearing in anime as being, how should I put it, intentional.
Yeah.
They almost seemed like they were sucked up from reading Western literature without understanding them, and then resprinkled back into the.
I mean, again, that's going to be one of the things I'll touch on in the series. But I think I'm only bringing it up because I think it is one of it's an example, at least for me, of a type of fantasy series that I actually like, because there's so much, because it actually feels real in the sense of it's not like the fantasy elements are not the characters and the plot are the characters, as opposed. But what I sort of wanted to touch on earlier, I was just going to mention is I saw there's some channel called Dishonored Wolf. I think it's run by a furry, so I'm not going to go back there. He did like this.
I don't know if he makes good content.
Yeah, not, right? I'm just kidding. But like he made like a ranting video critique of The Last Jedi, and it's like he was just like repeating the same lines of like, this movie's fucking shit, all these horrible bitches and SJ. He's like, he just sounds so angry in it, and he's like, Star Wars was such an important part of my life, and it's just like, you know, obviously like he makes good points about why the film didn't work, but like it's just like this, he's the sort of person where it's like I feel almost bad for it, where it's like these people that are attached to a corporate property, and like they feel betrayed by it. It's like this was a corporation.
It's not even altruistic anymore, right? It's not even.
Yeah.
You can't even claim that it's like the vision of a single person, because the property it's basically publicly traded at this stage.
Mm-hmm. Like
I mean, it's essentially a fanfic at this stage. I mean, these new movies, they feel like fanfics because they are fanfics, and that's fine. I mean, everything eventually becomes a fanfic. The question is, well, you know, why did Star Wars mean this to you, and what do you actually want this to mean for you going forward? Mm-hmm. Right? It certainly can't. I mean, the point of Star Wars can't be that I need to become increasingly invested in an extended universe that is literally a piece of corporate property.
I mean, I would say to him, right? Yeah, I mean, I would say to him, or it's like, because at the end he's like, you know, he like just screams, I no longer consider anything after the Return of the Jedi canon. It's like, I mean, that's the spot where it's like, okay,
why have a canon?
Yeah, why not just then, if you like the world of Star Wars, why don't you make your own fiction, make your own Star Wars?
Fanfic is, I think people run down fanfics, but mm-hmm. You know, this is how it typically, if these are indeed the new myths, then there are productive things that can come out of fanfics. It's not like, just 50 Shades of Grey.
It's like I've sort of mentioned this, but it's like, you know, people pay for a product, and it's like they don't even pay for product. They pay for a license. They pay for a trademark, and it's like, so people are going to be much more willing to sell to, like, why is it that people will pay like several $100s for a piece of crap painted figurine because it's an officially licensed from like Games Workshop, as opposed to like somebody makes their own handcrafted thing for a small fraction of the price.
If you buy it from Games Workshop, odds are you're going to have to paint it. But yeah, I get what you're saying, right?
Like
I did use kind of Games Workshop as sort of a notorious example. I probably shouldn't, since they're a smaller company. They're certainly not as nefarious as Disney, but they essentially, as a corporate body, they essentially are reselling a blended mix of different sci-fi universes back to fans for an incredibly marked up price.
And then like essentially tell them to shut up when they complain that, you know, they're being taken over by the progressives.
Yeah, and the thing is that large, and this is perhaps, if there is something that you could, if people wanted to watch this and they didn't have any interest in nerd culture whatsoever, the one take about would be that the reason this is happening is because of the interplay between Conquest's first and second law, which is that organizations start out Promethean, then conservative, then progressive. And what attracts the progressives are these huge piles of money that are laying around. Mm-hmm. The progressive instinct is naturally going to pertain to people who come into that money.
Yeah, and I think
so. You know, it's questionable, right? I mean,
and sadly, the only thing that I think, you know, fans of, say, let's just take Warhammer or Star Wars, is like you sort of mentioned in the video that like one possibility would be sort of like, what if, you know, a blow to these corporations would be if people just stopped caring about the trademark, if they cared about like the product, and like, you know, obviously there is going to be like, if somebody like, if just some like small startup, like a, you know, like let's say like 20 nerds in Seattle say like, we're tired of the Star Wars thing. We're going to make our own Star Wars stuff. Like, they'd have to deal with.
You couldn't literally make your own Star Wars stuff because you would literally get sued.
Yeah, and maybe in a way that could work to the benefit of, well, then if we can't do that, why don't we just make a Star Wars-like universe and make a derivative of that, and then start making our own thing.
Yeah, I mean that eventually, that would be nice. I would wonder if that would happen. Always the problem is that people join universes because of products. They don't build products for a universe, if you know what I mean.
Yeah,
I kind of phased in and out there, but because I had to go close to my microphone. But if you were to do that, right, it would involve someone creating like an open source board game or an open source or a really, really popular novel or a really, really popular cartoon, and then just going like, okay, I'm not going to patent this extended universe. And that's would be really hard to do, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because it could be the difference between, oh, hey, I can do this for a living, and I'm going to have to go back to my day job.
Which gives you less time to actually work on that product.
Yeah, exactly. And this is sort of the fundamental trade-off that we have, and maybe the internet will solve this eventually, right? But the thing is that intellectual property, as much as it is the way that these products become corporatized and subsequently progressivized through Conquest Second Law, it is also the way that the people who originally create these products make a dime on them.
Mm-hmm. Or in the case of wise people, many billions of dollars.
Well, yeah, but that's actually a fairly small percentage of the people. There are lots of people who are drawing checks from their fantasy creations, and very few of them are George Lucas.
Mm-hmm.
We oftentimes have the survivor's fallacy when it comes to figuring out exactly how much these properties are worth.
Could you explain that a bit?
Well, you see, if a survivor's fallacy means that if I were to look at a bunch of people who all went to Africa, like how many of them got Ebola and died? Well, none of them, right? Because they're all standing here and not dead.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So my impression, because I'm looking at the survivors, is that no one ever dies of this because the survivors show up. And the same thing is true with people who make money on fantasy. It's really easy to see the people who made millions and billions. It's hard to see the people who caught like $1,000, $10,000 off of something that was marginally popular.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, like, if we could move on a bit, like one of the other aspects of the series that you touch on is you even devote an entire episode to it. Is sort of it's called the emptiness of Rick Sanchez, I think, and it's commenting on the I suppose still popular show Rick and Morty, and just sort of what you see as one of the problems with a lot of these products. It's not just because they're corporate products, but they're also, a lot of the messages is often just seems to be like pure nihilism. Like if the flagship of nerd culture is Rick and Morty, and the message, if you could say,
I'm not so sure the flagship is the right way to put it. I'd say it's just a particularly obvious example of it, right?
Yeah.
It's a purified example of it. It doesn't itself command anything. I mean, probably the flagship in nerd culture is like Star Wars or Star Trek or something like that.
Yeah, that's a better way. It's just, it's a really good example, but
it's a good example of this kind of like cynical perspective on human nature that's sort of sold as being intelligent, right? Mm-hmm. And it's obvious that the people who created it share in some part of this view.
And you even point out the sort of I suppose the Nietzschean aspect, or the people creating it, like Justin Roiland and Dan Harmon, probably were nerds in high school, and now they're essentially bullies. Like his epic rant where he starts screaming about Nazis and taking a shit, like at the young white males. And ironically, the young white males, many of them probably did watch his show that just happened to disagree with him. He basically says are inhuman. Because when you call someone a Nazi, in our modern parlance, that essentially means you consider them to be non-human or subhuman.
Well, yeah, I mean, this is sort of... I honestly don't know what Dan Harmon thinks the world can or should look like.
Mm-hmm.
But it's hard to paint a picture that isn't just, well, I'm the smart one as like a TM, like that's the Dan Harmon worldview TM, right? And is there anything else you really need to know? I mean, I don't think that Dan Harmon's a communist. I don't even think he's an SJW in the sense that he reads bell hooks. He just thinks that he's really, really smart, and he has the impression that these opinions are held by non-smart people, regardless of what the ideas are. And some of this has to do with the fact that, I mean, this obviously was coming off the back of a social media interaction, so it's always hard. But I mean, it's not just that. I mean, we know from people like Bob Chipman that these attitudes are they're not like one-off attitudes, right? They're not just like, oh, Dan Harmon was drunk. These are sort of often repeated sentiments.
And I think, yeah, it comes from, I think you say in the series, like, maybe to psychoanalyze them for a bit, it's like they sort of felt like the recognition that they got for having genuine intelligence and talent in certain areas, it was overlooked and they didn't get the credit they deserved. And like, now when they actually have the power, when he's created this incredibly successful show, he's like, well, I'm the smart one atop the world. I have stared into the abyss. I am, it's like in your series, like Ethica Mundi, like on the North Pole, how there's like, what is it? Like, it's a throne that the person who's like the true Ubermensch is like, when they finally climb it, they reach that.
You're referencing a webcomic that probably nobody has read, but yeah, this is just the whole existentialist and somewhat Nietzschean worldview of sort of justifying your own meaning or creating your own meaning. There's only two ways to read this, and this is the two ways of creating your own meaning is that there isn't any meaning and you just kind of sublimate yourself into the masses, or it is that you in particular create your own meaning because you are the Superman or whatever. Right? And this is sort of I don't know what would I think the question isn't exactly was Dan Harmon psychologically wrong, but I guess what we wish Dan Harmon, if you were to find yourself in this position, what would an ideal Dan Harmon do?
And I think it's like
almost not so easy to see. I mean, that's a little bit hard, right? And I don't know. I mean, presumably, if you controlled millions of dollars, you could do all sorts of things.
But I think because you can sort of see though that in the character of Rick Sanchez, where it is this idea of, I'm the only person with any meaning. Look at all these horrible sheep with their superstitions and any idea. Everything is meaningless. Look how much but then like almost drawing attention to how much of a sort of drunk, nihilistic, horrible person he is. But
I don't know how much you haven't. Well, am I right in thinking that you don't watch Rick and Morty because I can't really get into the specifics about that particular show, but
I'm thinking
a general kind of like nihilism is present there. But the problem is it only makes so much sense to point that out because the show's creators almost admit that from the outset. So these sort of insults. If someone's like, I'm a nihilist, you're like, you're a nihilist. Okay, well, fine, they admitted it, right? So what are you going to say about it, right?
Yeah,
I guess it's more interesting to see exactly how they react to nihilism in their actual lives, and if there are any boundaries to it, because there always are, right?
Yeah. So. Well, apparently not in the case of like the episode you reference or the joke you reference where they break the boundaries you thought that they had set up.
Well, those weren't actually done with the show. Those were not actually. That was a fan made cartoon. It was. I think it was Justin Roiland, who does the voices. He was asked to read a trial transcript in the Rick and Morty voices, and he just didn't. It was really funny. It was really funny because it was so out of. We just sort of highlighted our own societal. I hate the word degeneration, but what else am I going to say? Societal decay, and it was really. And then the fans made the cartoon. So I guess what I said was that you could see there that they made jokes that they wouldn't make in the show. So it was obvious that the show does have boundaries. So it isn't nihil. The thing about the Rick and Morty is that they say they're nihilists, but they're not actually nihilists. Because there are boundaries that they won't cross. And the boundaries they won't cross are, specifically the things that make their audience feel uncomfortable. And you know, that kind of shows you how this is sort of a dishonest nihilism.
But in any case, I think the point of pointing out Rick and Morty is the fact that, like, or at least when I look at it, it's like, is this really what nerd culture is supposed to like embody? Like, either corporate products or just nihilism? Like, is there any, like, you know, there must be nerds or people that would identify within this community that, like, would presumably want something that's not just nihilism or just packaged dopamine buttons.
Well, packaged dopamine buttons is the video game industry, but but which I think is slightly different. So we're kind of mixing our peas and carrots. But I think a lot of people are asking them this. I think the question is, well, what should nerd culture be? And that's the question. It's not. Nerd culture would be very, very comfortable. Like, let's say, for instance, I'm not so sure exactly how wide the Rick and Morty backlash is. My impression is that, with the exception of a few communities on YouTube, everyone's just going to lap up season 4 like they lapped up season 3. But let's say that I'm wrong and this backlash is extensive, and Rick and Morty kicks off next season being incredibly unpopular, and everyone kind of sees through it and feels really uncomfortable, and it becomes sort of a laughing stock that's only watched by people who, like, don't get it. Nerd culture is very comfortable just doing an iteration where Rick and Morty becomes the next Big Bang Theory, and they move on to the next kind of edgy show that all of the cool kids like. But that's not better. That's just like doing the next iteration of a cycle that we don't want to continue anymore. There shouldn't be anything. Well, I don't know. This is another. I didn't mention this rule of culture for myself, and I record these things at once, so I don't always remember to say everything I wanted to say. But there shouldn't be an element of culture that immediately would make you uncomfortable if everyone in your life just suddenly got on board with it. Maybe I could think of something that I might defend, but, like, it's usually a red
Imagine
flag.
if everyone in your life became Catholic. That'd be wonderful.
Imagine if everyone in your life liked classical music. Imagine if everyone in your life
read Shakespeare.
Yeah, Shakespeare, board games. You know, these things that, you know, once it becomes, if everyone in your life likes Rick, and if people with, or not, let's say not everyone in your life, people with IQs of 90 or 85, they suddenly like the thing that you're trying to promote. You know, that shouldn't be a bad thing, right? But a lot of these situations, it's very hard to see how it would be good, because a lot of these things are just signaling. And that's the cycle that people have to start breaking out of, I think.
And that's one of the things that I find interesting, or it's something that I think is interesting to explore, is what exactly is the difference between, let's say, obsession over a lot of aspects of nerd culture and obsession over, let's say, you know, something like Shakespeare, or I think an aspect of history that you probably would find edifying, either art history or, let's say, church history. What is the difference? Like, let's say somebody is, like, totally obsessed with Shakespeare, like, they're like, their room is like littered with, like, posters of like famous Shakespeare plays, and, like, you know, that's like their obsession. Like, they've got, like, tons of pictures for that of, like, the desktop wallpaper.
You might be able to come up with an unhealthy way to be into Shakespeare.
Sure.
But presumably, the healthy thing about Shakespeare is, at the end of the day, that it is an actual play that can be performed for the edification and joy of actual other people. Right?
Yeah.
Most people who I know who are really into Shakespeare are really into putting on Shakespeare shows that will supposedly entertain other people. Or are really into teaching it, or really, I mean, they're fundamentally in a mode of sharing. Perhaps at the point where, like, you're collecting Hamlet trading cards, I'm not so sure it's markedly better. I mean, I guess it references something that actually happened. This is sort of like the historical thing, right? I guess in some sense, like, history is better than fantasy, but I think that's missing the main point. The main point isn't that it's fantastic and not historic. The main point is that it's being used as a status symbol and an identity that's not being shared.
Yeah, and I think that's what I was going to say, is I think that might be the key difference, or is that, you know, liking Shakespeare in the sense of wanting to put on a play, or liking church history so that you can explain it to other people and help draw them to the faith, or art history to show them, or even create your own actual works of edifying culture. Those are things that are not it's not solely based on consumerism or consumption, whereas so much of nerd culture is purely based on that.
I think it's consumption, but like I guess I'm trying to make a slightly more subtle point, I guess, right? I suppose a video game and a play are both consumption, but presumably, I mean, I know presumably there should be more authorship behind an involvement in the play, and that's what I think is the real way out of this. Real culture should be involving to the people who consume it. And you know, a perfect example is folk culture.
Yeah,
I'm a big folk music fan, and I could talk your ear off about that community. But it's fundamentally created by the people who listen to it in a very real way,
as opposed to a corporation. The relationship seems to be, I mean, it's localized and more evenly. It seems like it's distributed among the consumers and producers, as opposed to sort of a relationship of the corporate masters and the mindless consumers.
Yeah, I mean, I think corporations certainly encourage this attitude.
I mean, it makes them money.
Well, and this is always the hard thing because it takes money to do these things, right? Like, you're not going to get video games without a certain amount of capital being put down, and you're not going to get comic books or nice board. But I like a variety of really complicated Euro games and card games.
Those things are expensive.
Yeah, they're expensive. Well, they're not super expensive. They're about as expensive as your average video game, and they last a lot longer. But you know, at my age, it really becomes. I mean, an hour of time is worth more than the actual game is itself, right? When you get down to it,
especially with board games, since presumably you're actually playing with other people and you're playing with other people that are present with you. Like,
sure, yeah, and that's another thing too, right? Is it can only be done socially, which has a positive aspect towards it. But you know, the difficulty is that these things do take money at the end of the day, right? Like, you know, you can't expect the kind of output that it takes to produce things without having some money. And so they're sort of a natural trade-off. But I guess I've always just been hoping that perhaps some amount of internet organization could potentially start solving these problems a little bit. I don't know. It's something to think about at least. I mean, the real question is loyalistic culture versus mercenary culture. And I see that as sort of the fundamental trade-off that we see.
It's like you could sort of conceive it like a more healthy, let's say, an idealized nerd culture. It's something that, you know, first off, the creators and the creators and consumers are much more closely linked. That there's a much higher probability that they actually know each other more intimately than a corporate environment ever could. And it's they see the product not as something that they consume, but they have nothing to do with other than consuming it, but that they actively take part in.
And that's the thing, because like it or not, the things that we consume when it comes to nerd culture, they're not just like ephemeral little kill. I mean, I guess in some sense they are kill times, but typically in classic in classic society, people would define themselves by this kind of culture in a very real way.
And you sort of think about it when, like, for all the pro Gamergate people that were like, well, you know, there's no evidence that video games have like teach these behaviors to people, or, you know, violence or sexualization. But it's like, you know, I don't think if video games are, you know, if video games have absolutely no cultural effect on anybody, then you really can't say that they're art. And at that point, you have to admit that, well, they are pure time wasters, and, you know, people waste way too much time on them. At that point, like, why do you care if the progressives want them? Like,
at the point where they have no impact on your life, you're looking at like a few hundred hours into what eventually amounts to just dead time.
And it's weird because certain
attendant problems.
What I've noticed is certain games do tend to like there's a city simulating game called City Skylines, which is I sort of have to periodically delete it because it is a very addicting game that I just need to stop playing it because it's sort of instant. It's it's a high amount of like sort of stimulation for very little effort because it's like you just pop down a few streets and then you see this giant city, come before your eyes, as opposed to like a very story heavy game like Nier Automata. There's a high amount of stimulation in it, but it requires a substantial amount more focus to the point where I've never like played the game for more than 1 or 2 hours at a time before I just like, all right, I'm like satisfied for the day. I don't want to put in any more effort. I'm good. And I feel like that's a much more healthy approach to take, or it seems like it's a less sort of, I don't know, like addiction developing game. But yeah, because I'm just trying to say that to make the point that I think that there's like, because Nier Automata is one of my favorite games, but I look at the hours I have on that compared to like City Skylines, and I have far like really not that. It's like I wouldn't be embarrassed to show, even though like I've recorded the game several times to make footage for a review I'll do on it. Like I don't have an embarrassing number of hours on Nier Automata because I think it's not an addictive game. It's something that has a genuinely good story, fun gameplay, but you really don't want to play. There's no real incentive to play more than 1 or 2 hours at a time.
Well, sure. And, that's another question is, I mean, they're sort of, the difficulty with this is just sort of multiple questions with video games. And the first question is just like, how do you deal with these incredibly addictive, expansive sandbox experiences? And the next question is, how do we process these sort of 16-hour movies? Like, well, I'm guessing that's what Nier Automata is.
Yeah, I mean,
these 16-hour interactive movies that are like interactive immersive movies.
Mm-hmm.
And those are sort of, the problem is that they're both called quote unquote. And then there's esports. Well, esports are by far the easiest to deal with because they're essentially just extensions of things that we already know, like chess.
Mm-hmm.
But the other examples we have, like sandbox games that, I mean, have this sort of repetitive, addictive quality that it's hard to know really what to do with those. And then you have like 16 to 32-hour movies, and that, to my mind, are just sort of hobbled by the fact that they are video games to begin with.
Because when I think about it,
around that,
and I'll probably talk about this in the review, is that in many ways, Nier Automata could actually be better if it was just like an anime or a CGI movie. And I'm thinking like, one of the ways could just be, well, what if we just said, well, just give us a movie instead?
I'll give you an example of why. Okay, I'll put it this way. Like, if I love Shakespeare, right? Like, what is the like, think of it, your average Shakespeare nerd, right? Like, or your average classical music nerd. What's like their number one joy?
Listening to the music.
No.
Oh.
I would say it's not.
Really?
No. Well, okay,
performing the
my
music.
Understanding. Perhaps. That's closer. I would say it's sharing the music with somebody else and looking at seeing them see it for the first time.
Mm-hmm.
Because they're in love with it and they want to share it with somebody else.
Okay.
But herein lies the difficulty of something. The last video game I played, like, aside from like minor relapses that have occurred in the last 3 or 4 years that didn't last for very long, the last video game like I played before I effectively stopped buying games on Steam, was BioShock Infinite. And BioShock is a game that I've just wanted to share with people, and it's impossible to share with like most people I think should see it. And this is like the fundamental problem with it. It's just the most important thing I want to do with this commercial product. The medium itself makes it almost impossible to do. What it does make it very possible to do is replay BioShock again to see if I can like get through it by using like limited ammo or like play it on nightmare difficulty. But like, is that the reason why I played it? I guess I could relive it, right? But I'm still just like reliving my initial experience. I'm not trying to build the joy in somebody else that I see that I myself experienced, right? And in some sense, like performing the music is a similar thing. Presumably the performer is trying to recreate the joy he sees in his own music in his audience. And this is something that I think is always the big difficulty with video games. if I consume a video game, how do I go and share it with somebody who I think needs to see it?
I mean, I think
really
somebody
hard.
in the chat pointed it out. Says maybe this sort of desire can explain why Let's Plays are so popular.
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, the people like share around Let's Plays. Maybe this is something that just is not my generation.
Well, people watch Let's Plays constantly. I mean, I do myself, but it's
people watch Let's Plays usually because they want to have like white noise in the background.
No, that's good as well. But it also, they also want to see people scream at the games because the frustration gives them, you know, humor. But
I mean, that kind of is strange, right? Because have you ever given someone like a real life friend or family member a video game for them to play? And
I think
like, oh yeah, that was an awesome video game, Fritz. Thanks.
I mean, yeah, presumably, me and my brother have done that a bunch, and yeah. Although
Okay,
I think that's
I mean, maybe I've done that with my. That's a rare experience for me. I maybe did that once or twice. Like to me, it just seems like, you know, you kind of hear about these consumer products and like, and you kind of pick them up from Steam or whatever. Yeah, I don't know. It doesn't seem like the same thing as like seeing a movie or showing someone a movie that you love or whatever.
It's also the time. It's also the time investment, because like you give someone a book, they can just instantly open the book at any point and read it for 5 minutes and then close it again. Or you show someone a movie, okay, it's, you know, like 2 hours long. All right, now they're done. Games are upward. You know, if you just like a narrative focused game is why usually, you know, 16 to 40 hours long. Most people probably just don't have the like, you can't just turn on your computer. First off, you have to have a console or computer able to play it. Then you have to have the time investment to play it for several hours over the course of like a week or so.
Yeah, and this is the thing though, right? I mean, like, I don't want to like, why I do want to go here because this is sort of the most interesting thing I think we're talking about, because it kind of isolates my central problem. I mean, culture is designed to be shared.
Mm-hmm.
It's designed in its best form. It's sort of a mechanism for communicating in between generations. And this is my fundamental problem with video games. It just shows shit at doing that, right? Like when I was, when I was an older teenager and in early, like just after out of high school, and like I got into like, I just felt like I couldn't communicate anything to my parents, but like I could give them like my music CDs and they could listen to them, and they did listen to them. And they felt like they kind of understood that, right? Mm-hmm. And, you know, of course, there's intergenerational changes in music too, but there was a connection there. And, you know, I could like introduce them to something like Nick Drake, right? So that they just couldn't exist with a video game. The only people who have ever shared video games with me are so, like, they're so aligned to me already that we're literally like on the same program doing the same thing in our free time when we're like are in our rooms with our doors closed. Mm-hmm. You know, it's a strange thing, and I maybe I'm not maybe this is something that's only in my experience, but to me that
I can definitely see that. I think there's also the fact that, like, you know, there's movies and there's whose telephone is ringing.
Yeah, it's mine.
Telephone, cell phone, whatever. But it you know, one of the problems is that, like, there's books, there's plays, there's music, there's movies that are, you know, there's a timelessness built into so many of them that it's, you know, partially it's probably because of the rapid pace of technology, but a huge number of video games just like you are not like, they can't hold up. Even like ones you look at back in your childhood, it's like, you know, they look like shit now. I mean, in a way though, interestingly enough, just a small tangent on graphics is like, if I go back to play like Mega Man X or stuff from the Super Nintendo, like, it's weird, like the 16-bit era, it seems like they managed to get the graphics to actually look very good to a point where they can actually hold up much better than a lot of like 3D games. Like Super Mario World still looks leagues better than Super Mario 64 does. But I don't really think that's a way that you could, because I'm thinking like, you know, maybe I want to show, when I have kids, show them like Spyro the Dragon or Crash Team Racing, games I was first introduced to when I started playing games at like 5 or 6. And I suppose in a little way there, but they're not really something that can I'm not really. They're not something. First off, they're not something I had any involvement with. They're a product that my parents bought for me. It's not the same way. You can't really have that same experience. Maybe you could, and maybe technology will enable you to be able to. But I definitely see the problem there.
Yeah, this is sort of the open question with video games. We really, I mean, I don't know, maybe Generation Z is going to be the one that, you never really understand a technology until you get to a generation where both sides of the generational gap both have experience with the technology. And my parents never grew up with video games or anything even remotely like video games.
Mm-hmm.
The closest thing we had that was like that was television. And even then you could see sort of like we were the first, in many ways, the millennials were the first generation that really grew up with television. Because they're the first generation.
Television's, at least as we've known it, is starting to be phased out because people just use streaming on the internet now.
Yeah, but I guess I'm just using television in the more general sense. I'm using it in the sense that people sitting at their couches watching something in their homes on TV. And that's what I mean by it. And I guess the Xers might have been the first generation to have both their parents and themselves both growing up with television. But I think that for the most part, the big one was the boomers.
Yeah, and I think we can start wrapping up now. Giving this has been a good talk. I think going forward, it's just. I think these conversations are delving into actual culture that you and I both would find edifying is something that I think is a worthwhile endeavor. I'm just sort of rambling now, but because again, I feel when I look at a lot of nerds, like I mentioned that guy that reviewed that gave this sort of scathing, because it got a lot of dislikes, even though probably had the vast majority of people that probably watched the video agreed with him. When Red Letter Media did their review of The Last Jedi, they didn't get massive numbers of dislikes. I think it's because I almost feel bad for a lot of these people where they're so attached to these corporate products that are controlled by corporations that sort of fundamentally, at best view them as sheep to, exploit, and at worst they seem to actively hate them, to the point where any representation of white males in comic books, video games, movies, any of this, they're essentially just trying to, destroy, excise, make all comic book characters gay, black, or female. And I'm just wondering, when are these people going to recognize this and say, you can't just make it so that you can play the video games produced by these corporations that hate you and just keep doing this forever? First off, it's not healthy. Secondly, it's just not going to happen.
Aren't we all in that position, though? I mean, I haven't forsworn off corporate media.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I don't know. I think that we need to start building alternatives. But I mean, if I were to give up on all corporate media, that would be a pretty massive.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not so much that
urge of my consumption of any kind of media, and this is, I think we kind of highlighting, and this is sort of where I want to take the conversation, and that is, I mean, it really comes down to what are the communities that we're building, what are the alternatives we're building, and we can see it in people that have low IQs or that have autism. But the difficulty is that people with low IQs and have autism, they're basically dark reflections of what people who have more intellectual wherewithal are doing. They like large crowds, right? So this is they always go to what's popular, and the trendsetters are the people who actually have the intellect. And so you hop around this stuff, and you'll continue to hop around as long as that's your trend, right?
Mm-hmm. People.
The problem, in many ways, as good as Red Letter Media is at its craft, you can't expect them to do a snarky Star Wars review and not have a bunch of idiots do a snarky Star Wars review after it gets that popular.
Yeah.
The problem is not the person who has a low IQ. There will always be people who have. And Dr. Random Cam did an excellent video on Samantha Bee, and he said, "Here's a revelation for all YouTubers: morons like you, and the bigger channel you are, the more morons like you." Presumably, even if we got people into church, there would be morons, and there were morons, and that was the stock and trade of the New Atheist, was to isolate these morons and hold them up as the quintessential example of the Christian.
Yeah.
But this is just the thing, right? So if you're going to say, oh, how are we going to make nerd culture better? What you really are asking is, how do you make red letter media better? Or how do you make Wizards of the Coast better? Or how do you make the fan fiction community at its highest level better? And how do you try to break out of some of these loops? Because it's always led from the front, and criticizing sort of the cringiest incarnations of it at the rear. The cringiest incarnations at the rear kind of make you aware of the problem, right? The people having riots outside of McDonald's because they're not getting Szechuan sauce make you aware that there's a problem with Rick and Morty. But the problem isn't that there are these idiots who like the Szechuan sauce.
The problem is like
Dan. The problem is Dan Harmon. Yeah, exactly. Right. So the thing is so looking at the people, that takes you on a journey that brings you to where Dan Harmon is. But then the question is, and even saying F off Dan Harmon, you're an idiot, that's not sufficient, right? Because
he's not
Dan Harmon isn't an isolated, he's not like this individual, he's not like the original vampire of this culture, he's a product of it. So the question is, well, what would be the role of a creator who's built something like this be? Right? Like what did I want to see? What was I hoping to find at the end of the rainbow, right? Like what do I want this person to be, the creator, like, or the person, what do I want him to build? And once you have that answer down, you have a hint about what the next step is going to be and how you might actually end the cycle.
Yeah, and I think, looking at prior, I suppose if this might be a bit of this might be reiterating what you're trying to say, is like people that like this type of culture, like us, I think to a large extent still do, is that, what I think people that like this culture should ask is, what do we want out of it? Why do we consume this? And,
yeah, and that's an interesting question, because I think it has a lot of different answers. And why, I don't know. I mean, is it better to get really into something to the extent that you're actually working in that community to like bring it forward? Would that destroy your enjoyment of that thing? Would it become sort of, would it become like a second job? I don't know. That's always the question, right? Like,
and this is the problem, right? Is that a huge amount of people that just like let's say, the people that watch the Star Wars movies that aren't just, because everybody watches the Star Wars movies, apparently, except me. I mean, I watched all of them except the last one, but
my fiance dragged me into the Star Wars movie.
I'm glad I didn't see it. But
it's an interesting cultural artifact.
I mean, from all the stuff
the Star Wars movies that have come out, they're interesting cultural artifacts.
I at the very least, I'm actually feel a little bad now, because like hearing about all the stuff that happens, it almost seems like comically terrible. Like I feel like if I saw it, I'd probably laugh at moments that were supposed to be quite, like meaningful. But
I laughed at a few moments. There were a lot of people who laughed at a few moments who were that's the thing. There were people laughing at the theater when Princess Leia did the Mary Poppins thing. Like there were, and this was like the second night it was out. I mean, I know the critics gave it like 95%, but
the audience gave it like 48%.
I think that there might have been some collusion in film journalism there, to borrow a Gamergate term.
No.
But Star Wars, it's an interesting cultural artifact. And I think that where were we on so I say this, for instance, to bring it to sort of what you talk about on your channel. You've been sort of looking into this monarchy thing, and maybe you should explore this, because in some sense, I think what people do want from Dan Harmon is they want noblesse oblige.
Yeah.
But the thing is that they don't understand is that if Dan Harmon is under noblesse oblige to be sort of uplifting to his audience, then the smarter members of the Rick and Morty fandom are obligated by noblesse oblige to Well, I'd say aspire to be creators and community organizers of these cultural consumption products themselves. And this is,
you could almost sort of see this as sort of a compromise or a way to mediate the fact that if you need corporations, if you need the corporate structure in order to have the money to produce culture like this, if there was some way to, I don't know, promote or introduce a noblesse oblige idea of, yes, you are the people that are smart enough to create this stuff. You are the leaders. You do have high status, but you lead by example. You are not the Brahmins that hold the sacred knowledge, and you can't treat the people that consume your culture like they're essentially subhuman. You have to treat them, yes, they consume this product, but they are human beings, and that we have.
The question is that possible, right? In the
yeah, and that's I believe it is, but it just
really
remains to be seen.
Producing people like that, right? I mean, like, it's not going to. I mean, we can't generate it by going to Dan Harmon and wagging our finger and going, "You have to be more noblesse oblige." I mean, could it possibly be generated from some highly organized fan community?
Maybe.
In some sense, the SJWs tried to do that in 2012. Right. Mm-hmm. Now, did they? In some sense, they tried to create a quasi-moral community based around these cultural products. The aspiration wasn't bad. Their attempt just failed.
Yeah.
And so the question is, did the attempt fail because they're an insane ideology that can't do anything, which is certainly possible. God knows that the left has been able to fail at things that ordinary systems can do quite easily, like running a modern nation's economy, Venezuela. But or is it just because modernity is such that you can never create moral communities like this? This is sort of like I call the tragic fate of Jiminy Cricket, right? Like if I'm in the real world and I decide to do something, like I can exert sort of some peer pressure on people to do it. But in internet land, I'm always just like, there's always like this big X button. So like you can never ever get anyone to do anything that they don't already really, really want to do. So your ability to sort of like create pressure is really, really limited.
And I think that's one of the big problems with online communities is I talked about that in my drama video, that one of the biggest problems is that the peer pressure that can be exerted on people is so mitigated by the fact that regardless of the platform you're on, like even right now, I could turn my computer off or just press the hang up call button and because for all I know, you're just a voice coming through my computer. Like you're not real in the sense that like my brain normally would process a real person. And that sort of mitigates so much of your sort of social interaction, because if I'm in a room with a bunch of other people, I'm a little uncomfortable. I mean, I'll probably want to, subconscious part of me wants to like just leave, but you sort of understand you really can't do that instantaneously. And it's like, that will actually have a lot more drastic effects in real life. Like if I'm with a group of friends and like I'm a bit angry at them and I just like storm out, like that actually means something, as opposed to if I get a little angry on Discord and I just like exit out, it's like I'll just come back later and everything will more or less go back to normal.
Mm-hmm. I mean, this is sort of the dynamic that we haven't quite figured out how to do. I mean, Twitter is the ultimate example of this. Twitter is just like a dialogue pool that was never meant to exist in human society.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Facebook is bad enough, and then Twitter kind of took it to the
Facebook is everything you really wouldn't say to normal people that you would see. This is all.
Facebook is posturing. It's like the purified form of posturing. Twitter is like the purified form of bragging, and they're different. They're fundamentally different emotions, right? In Twitter, everyone is a braggart and a lout, or a shrill. Mm-hmm. And in Facebook, everyone is always just posing for smiley photos in front of their latest achievement or bowl of noodles or whatever.
My achievement is a bowl of noodles.
Well, I'm stealing that from Reactionary Expat. He characterized his extended family as just their entire Facebook history was just duck faces in front of bowls of noodles. But that's
I feel
neither
so
here nor
bad
there.
for any aliens looking at us right now.
Well, no, I mean this is the thing that we need to start figuring out, right? If we can create, and I'm not so sure how much of this can be done purely online, and the other problem is money too, right? Because now because of online, you're just sort of incentivized to be kind of like highly self-promotional, and so community building kind of gets shoved a little bit, like because if you work really hard to build up a community, like you're sitting there like plowing all this time and effort in, and then people are reaping the rewards, and there's a huge freeloader problem, right? Whereas people who are just self-promoting, like they can turn that potentially into the money. And so all of these questions are just like, these are just questions that we have to answer. And the question is not, I mean, first of all, I mean, it's not who's the original vampire. It's not Dan Harmon. Why aren't you Louis? Why aren't you King Louis of France? The question is there a way we can construct something that facilitates this more effectively in the modern world?
Being able to create not just individual, because anybody can, I mean, not anybody. I mean, an individual can create a work of science fiction or fantasy that we might like, which technically was what I'm doing for my job, but which I'm very fortunate to be able to be doing. But it's like a broader community of people is more necessary. But I think because I don't want this to go on too long, I don't want these to really. I think I could end just like with a thought, and then you could give your closing thoughts. Is, you know, one of the things I think we've both talked about is that, like, one way that you might be able, that we could mitigate, or that the sort of corporatized system of nerd culture consumption, it can be mitigated, is if you essentially make it so that you make a product and you make a story that doesn't continue, that you just have a, like, there's not a War and Peace 2, there's not a King Lear 2, there's not a King Lear cinematic universe, and you know, as opposed to the way, and it's like, if you do that, it's like let's take one of the modern Star Wars movies that I actually quite liked, Rogue One. Like, yes, it's part of this greater, you know, let's take it out of the context that it is of the big Star Wars universe. If you just took the movie in itself, you know, because of how that story unfolds, the story itself is a standalone story. They can't make a Rogue One 2. They can't make an extended universe with all the characters because of just the nature of how that story is made. And I think ultimately that makes it, you know, not only does it, I think when you don't, I have to think that perhaps, you know, when you have all of these movies, because I think we've all seen those timelines of, here's all the movies Disney, which controls half of the media now, is going to make for the next 20 years. It's like, if you turn into an assembly line production, like, there's gotta be some loss of quality and creativity there. If you're just sort of making, this is the story I want to tell, I don't want to create a massive universe, because that's not really what creating a story is. Like, I talked about this with Chris Lansdowne last time, but like the stories I'm creating it's the problem with so much of science. I'll talk about this later, is like, the last thing I like hearing when people praise a video game is, there's this immersive world you lose yourself in. I'm thinking, first off, that's probably the last thing modern man needs, is to further reject reality. And secondly, like, you know, that's not what makes a story interesting. Like, Middle Earth is not what ultimately makes Lord of the Rings interesting. Frodo and Sam and Aragorn are. But anyways, that's enough of that rant. Thank you for coming on, Distributist. Do you have any closing thoughts?
Not particularly. I probably talked much too much on this stream. We can connect whatever we want to offline.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for coming on. Thank you, Distributist, for showing up. I'll link him in the description. And yes, to do some self-promotion, I do have a Patreon, but think of that as you will. Thank you, everybody. This is Fritz Imperial signing off.